I have to find the right connections here. It's my job to find the connections, after all. After what I saw 2 nights ago, I have to figure something out, as this is much stranger than even I ever believed. My name is Maxwell Warwick. I'm an agent with the FBI, and I'm considered one of their top explainers. If that confuses you, then let me explain. It is my job, after all. Investigators are the feelers the agency sends out to collect data and make sense of the mundane and the difficult to explain. They're responsible for things that are easy to pack away in a box and store on the FBI's archives. They are responsible for closing neat little cases that can be brought up at cocktail parties and re-election campaigns. Explainers, well, they're not so lucky. We solve the cases that aren't clearly explainable. We operate in the shadows, looking for things that no one talks about. When a case can't be closed up neat and tidy with a little bow, they call in the explainers, and we explain what it is that lurks outside the public consciousness. To answer your inevitable question, yeah, it's a lot like the X-Files, but with way more paperwork and far less creature-of-the-week content. The truth is that people are generally scary enough all on their own. They don't need ghosts or pyrokinesis to explain most cases. If aliens exist, I've never had to debunk them, and they've managed to stay off my radar. Mostly what I do is investigate government entities that seem to think they can make up outlandish claims to deflect FBI scrutiny. Money missing? Oh, it must have been embezzled by a Russian hacker that just so happens to have the same IP address as your IT guy. Documents missing? Must be Chinese assets. It can't be the file clerk with a case of kleptomania. Missing child who's up and vanished under mysterious circumstances near a lake but can't be found? Usually it's not a dinosaur or a large animal. Usually it's the local pervert. So yeah, it's just like the X-Files. If the X-Files were boring. At least, it was until about 3 weeks ago. My boss called me up to his office with a special case. These cases are rare. I've had about 3 in my whole 10-year career, and they usually aren't nipped up so easily. Administrator Hires scowled at me from over his desk as he handed me the envelope. I was surprised to see my name already on it. I had been a much younger agent who had been investigating an accident about 3 years ago involving a gas leak at a comedy club. This was during a time when a lot of these weird circumstances were turning out to be mob hits or special interest groups taking out targets and neutralizing assets. These guys didn't care if they killed civilians while they tied up their loose ends. As long as the target was neutralized, it didn't matter one bit to them. Are we reopening the laughing murders, boss? Hires nodded. I don't suppose you caught last night's Guy David tonight, did you? I shook my head. I don't watch a lot of TV, boss. Seems his whole audience, Guy included, was killed in a gas leak. He used air quotes for the last word. He handed me another file and I cracked it open, reading over the transcripts and shaking my head. Anyone take credit for it? No, and that's odd for these guys. No one ever took credit for the comedy club either, the Canadian TV set in the 90s, or the gymnasium at Walters High School in 2010. Groups that do this sort of thing are usually more than happy to brag about it afterwards. I want you to explain this to the board, figure out who's behind this, and make it stop. I furrowed my brow. Do we believe that all of these are connected somehow? Hires blew out a long, suffering breath, and I saw him look longingly at the ashtray on his desk. One of his daughters had written 10 years clean in it, but you could tell that these were the days when he really wanted a cigarette. When I had started, he had smoked like a chimney, but he gave it up after his first and only heart attack about 8 months into my career. Someone on the board must have leaned on him hard as he was thinking about sliding off the wagon again. I hope so, Max. If not, we're totally fucked on this one. Along with the Guy David incident, there were 3 others from all over the United States. A musician who'd written his own suicide note and published it on YouTube. A surgeon whose last recorded treatment sounded a lot like Guy's guest on that fateful night, Roger Carlson. The last was a funeral in the Midwest for a teacher. The husband had given a rather chilling eulogy, of which only one online clip existed, before the whole place had also died of a gas leak. None of these people had anything in common. To my knowledge, they had never even met, but they had all died tragically in what was being called a gas leak. The coroner's report in all 6 cases read like a carbon copy. I almost thought it was the same guy until I realized that he would have to be in his 60s, as well as working in 4 states and Canada. 4 had been found with the laughing rictus on their faces as well. The eulogy giver, a man with the unfortunate name of Frank Flozzy, had been found behind the pulpit with an ear-to-ear grin. He had asphyxiated, laughed himself to death as his lungs cried out for air, and the others in the church had done about the same. Ditto the surgeon, found against the washroom wall with the only smile his friends said he'd ever worn, and ditto Frank Carlson when they'd found him in that closet. The comedy club and the guy from the Canadian studio were a little harder to explain. The Canadian studio, Escar Productions, had a body count in the double digits, but both Mark Ayers and Kenneth Merst had survived. The fireman who came to the scene found them in a broom closet, catatonic, but still alive. Some 20 years later, though, Mark had committed suicide. They found him with a gun shoved in his grinning mouth, and Kenneth had been found in his bed, asphyxiated and smiling like an idiot. Another apparent gas leak, but 20 years after the studio leak. Had Kenneth been the asset they were trying to get rid of? Who would want to kill a kid that bad? Were they trying to tie up loose ends? Why wait so long? Then there was Justin Moore, the comedy club survivor. He had escaped in the nick of time, just like the kid on the high school leak. A year later, though, he had been found in his bed at the hotel he worked at, dead from asphyxiation. They said he'd been smiling, his stomach muscles bruised, his lungs almost collapsed from the spasming laughter as he died. They all seemed unconnected, yet the connection was their death. The only survivor, Shahid Perot, lived in Connecticut. Maybe he had some answers. I boarded a plane, and 12 hours later, I was sitting at the kitchen table in Shahid's apartment. The poor guy looked rough. His eyes almost looked like someone had punched him, and I could see him furtively glancing around as we sat drinking coffee. The apartment didn't look like a bachelor pad, a woman's touch apparent throughout, but when I inquired about her, he gritted his teeth and said she had left to see her mother. If they were broken up, it wasn't long ago, I'd wager. Look, I know this may be difficult to talk about, but can you tell me about that day in the gymnasium? He jumped, startled, this clearly being the last thing he'd expected for me to ask him about. Why do you want to know about that? I'm working a case, and the events you went through are very similar to the events that have happened in these cases. So far, you're the only survivor of these events, and your testimony could be key to establishing a connection. He shook as he drank his coffee. He looked more like an old man than a kid, not even in his 30s. He stalled, and I let him. This was likely the most traumatic event of his life, and rehashing it with a complete stranger was probably not how he wanted to spend his Tuesday morning. But I had the badge, so it was my job to dredge up these old traumas and reopen these old wounds. What a great job I have, right? It was the class presidency speech. I was nervous. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was nervous, okay? I got up on stage and started talking, and the people started laughing at me. Laughing? Why? Did you say something funny? No, he shot back and looked at the corner before tracking back to me. I wasn't a popular guy in high school, and, well, people laughed at me sometimes. I started getting nervous, and then I saw that everyone was laughing. Their faces were stretching into smiles, and their skin was turning black, and I just ran. I ran and I ran until I got home. I didn't even know about the gas leak until later that day. I collapsed on my front porch, and my mom took me to the hospital. I was the only survivor of the incident, to my knowledge. Most of the senior class was wiped out, and I think I was one of 5 that graduated that year. His description of the smiling faces had made me think about the victims and how they had died. All of them had died smiling, died laughing, and that couldn't be a coincidence. This kid had dodged a real bullet, that was clear. But what was the connection between all of this? They all had died laughing, died in different states and different times, but they had all died in the same way. This was no coincidence. I thanked him and rose to leave, but he stopped me and went to get something from his bedroom. He came back with, of all things, a graduation announcement. It declared the reunion for the class of 2010 would be held at 7 p.m. that night for all the graduates. The picture looked like it had been taken in the gym, but the floor was black, and the message at the bottom almost sounded sinister, given the events that had happened there. The picture looked a lot like the file picture I had of the gym floor after the incident. Bodies lying around, grinning at the ceiling. See you soon. was printed at the bottom. Given what the picture was missing, it made my skin crawl for some reason, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. "When did you receive this?" I asked, flipping it over and checking the address. "About 2 weeks ago. Can you see them?" He almost whispered the last bit, as though he was ashamed and terrified of my answer. "See what?" I asked, flicking it back over. "See the... Never mind," he said suddenly. He made excuses then, saying that he had to get ready for work, and made it pretty clear that he was done entertaining me. He showed me out, and I gave him my card in case he thought of something else. The door slammed shut behind me, and I wondered if I'd ever talk to that kid again. It was a weird thought to have, apropos of nothing, but it followed me down the hallway and out to my car. I started driving back to the airport, but turned into a hotel instead. I didn't feel like I was done with this case just yet. I took a room as I started reading through the case files. Shahid had wanted to tell me something important, but he'd been afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid I'd mock him? Or afraid that I would believe him and something would come after him? I went back to the statement of the 2 boys from the Canadian studio. The youngest, Mark, had mostly been silent throughout the interview. The other one, though, he'd been very vocal about the strangeness, the dark creatures that had come in and caused the whole incident. He had denied any sort of a gas leak, saying that these dark creatures were the cause of all of this. Then, 20 years later, he'd been taken off the board. I then looked at the comedian's profile, but he had never actually spoken to the police or anyone. In truth, they believed that he had died in the club until they found him dead later. Could he have come across these creatures as well? There was no other mention of these creatures in any other report, so I decided to watch Jarrett's last video before his death. As the video started, he clearly looked off camera. His face was a mask of fear and anticipation. I had seen Shahid do the same thing while he sat at the table, and the look was a little too familiar to be ignored. I kept watching, looking for clues as he played out his final dirge. The song was long and halting, his heart sliding over the strings as he belted out his final words, and in retrospect, it should have been obvious what he intended. As I watched, I saw something pass behind him, just for a split second, and I rewound so I could try and pinpoint it. Going frame by frame, I finally caught it, and it chilled me to the bone. This was what Shahid had been trying to tell me about. Its body was like living midnight, its skin a constant moving mass of darkness, and its teeth seemed too big even to stretch those non-existent lips. Its skin seemed to move even with the video paused, and despite it having no eyes, I felt it watching me. This was what Jarrett had killed himself to get away from. This was what Shahid had been searching for in the corners of his house. Had this been what made the comedian die laughing and taken both Mark and Kenneth before their time? What even was this thing, and why did it stalk the corners of their lives? As I studied it, it suddenly swung its face to look at me. Its teeth gleamed wetly within the video, and I recoiled as it leaned in to study me. Its eyeless face looked into my soul, and I knew that even from the confines of this video, it could hurt me. It stepped a little closer, unaffected by the frozen world that it found itself in, coming towards me before I slammed the laptop shut and pushed it off the bed. It fell to the floor of the hotel room, the carpet stopping it from breaking, and when I opened it a few minutes later, the image was gone. I called Shahid and headed for my car as I tried to control my erratic breathing. The phone went to voicemail. I called him 3 more times, but it went straight to voicemail every time. The greeting was from a much happier time and a much happier man, his voice full of bounce and cheer, as he told me that he wasn't in right now, but if I left a message, he would call me back. I closed the phone, doubting that he would, even if I saw fit to leave him a message. I knew where he was. Hadn't he showed me the invitation? Hadn't he as good as told me where he would be tonight? The high school was dark when I pulled up in front of the drop-off area. The school had been closed for the night, but I found the gym doors unlocked. Someone had put up a morbid black banner over the top of it that read, "Welcome Class of 2010. Across the door was another banner, broken in half now as though the recipient had found it when he opened the door. It too was black, and it looked dumb and generic somehow, like it had come from a standard printer in any office and someone had simply taped it up last minute. The broken banner across the door read, "Welcome back, Shahid." I went inside, gun drawn, but I needn't have bothered. He was alone in the gymnasium, the lights from the window creating an island for him to stand in. He hadn't noticed me, his mind off God knew where, as he stood there on the platform, the same one from that faithful day. The bleachers were pulled out, seemingly empty, but as he turned to look, I could see something oozing around in them. They didn't seem to bother him. As I watched, he smiled, stretched his arms out as though inviting an old friend in for a hug. When I called out, he turned for the briefest of moments. Then the darkness swooped in and took him. It hit him like a flood, inky bodies falling on him in a tidal wave of midnight, and he was lost beneath them. He didn't struggle. He didn't even move. He just accepted it and let them fall over him as they moved him from the island of light into the miasma of blackness in the gym. I heard my gun bark, unaware that I had pulled the trigger, but it acted as a beacon to the swarming inky hell. They turned towards me, uniform and as precise as a military color guard. They flowed at me like a raging river. I was panicking, lobbing shots at them, but I might as well have saved my bullets. The tide rose, nearly touching the ceiling, and fell on me like a clenched fist. I swirled inside them, feeling the urge to laugh, but trying to put it aside. If I laughed, they would have me, and I did not want to be had. I was blind, deaf, my mouth made dumb by the dark rush, and I suddenly was swirling before an all-too-familiar face. The masses looked mostly the same, sleek black heads and grinning faces, but I felt sure that this was the one I had seen in the video. Was this the alpha creature? Was this their leader? Did they have concepts like that? He cocked his eyeless head and seemed to contemplate me. For something without eyes, I felt judged like I never had before. He wasn't judging whether I was tasty. He was judging whether I was dangerous, whether I was worthy. He was judging my merits, my worthiness. This was no brainless creature. It did not consume needlessly, and if it wanted me, it would have me. It did not fear me, nor did it fear any creature. These things were old. These things, they were above such concepts as fear. Thankfully, I was found wanting. "Go away," it hissed, its voice like a serpent at the bottom of a deep well. "You are not for us, but if you interfere, we will take you where you do not want to go." It threw me with the black mass that held me, and I sailed through the void as its alien strangeness overpowered my senses. I woke up in my hotel room as my phone began to blare. It was my boss. "Hires, the witness from the school incident's been taken. This isn't some terrorist group. It's a thing. It's taking people for some reason. And Warwick, what the hell are you babbling about? Whatever it is, it'll have to wait. I need you on the first plane to Atlanta. There's been an incident in a local court case that fits the MO. I need you there yesterday." I looked at the phone, breathing heavily. Another one? What the hell was going on? A court case would be a pretty public spot for something like this. Would the creature risk giving itself away like that? "Boss, I need you to listen. I don't have time, Warwick. I have my own fish to fry, and you have a plane to catch. Get on it." Then he hung up on me. I slid the phone into my pocket. It appeared I was heading to Georgia. Court is now in session. All rise for the Honorable George Kane. My lawyer and I stood as the judge walked in. He glanced out at the assembly, his eyes falling to me, before he took his seat and set a pair of little half-moon spectacles and read over the court docket. I watched him as he looked over the case information and couldn't help but catch the glance he shot at me. I knew who he was. They all did. But they didn't realize that they were about to see the last thing any of them expected to today. They were about to see me walk away scot-free. Court is now in session. Case 2274, State v. Murphy, the bailiff read, stepping back and looking at the judge. "Prosecutor, you may make your opening statements." The prosecutor for the state was tall, his suit looking like it must have cost a fortune, if they charge by the foot, that is. And when he rose, you would swear he topped out at 7 feet. I'd been expecting they would send an older man, a more seasoned prosecutor, but this guy looked like he was barely 25. He turned his back on my lawyer and I, addressing the jury in a soft, cultured voice,
that seemed at odds with his size. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is well known that on August 4th, 2018, Emma Parker was hitchhiking up Route 12 after exiting her boyfriend's car after the two had a nasty spat. She was then picked up by Mr. Alex Murphy as she neared the number 24 off-ramp. Her body was discovered in the rest stop bathroom near Decatur 2 days later, a rest stop that Mr. Murphy had been seen dropping her off at. Mr. Murphy's vehicle also contained hair follicles and traces of blood from the victim. Given the proximity of Mr. Murphy to the crime scene and the evidence present in his truck, we will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mr. Murphy is the murderer. I scoffed quietly as the man sat back down. Beyond a shadow of a doubt might be a little challenging. All the evidence they had was circumstantial at best, and I knew it. They would have an easier time proving I hadn't killed her. My lawyer would have little trouble getting me out of this, so I could get back to business. Back to the business of hunting. Defense, you may make your opening statement. My lawyer approached the jury, and I found myself glaring at him as he left. This Weasley little fuck had cost me way more than I felt comfortable with, but if he got me off, then it would be money well spent. He had talked a big game in his office, telling me about the clients he'd gotten out of jail and the cases he'd won, but I had a feeling that most of that was puff and blow. He did not convey the same level of confidence the prosecutor had, but I barely needed him to. The case was open and shut. They had nothing on me, would have nothing on me, and we all knew it. Now, he just had to convince the jury. Men and women of the jury, the accusations leveled against my client are egregious. The victim's blood and hair in my client's truck were there not because of his actions, but the actions of Mr. Chadwick Rolls, who I notice is neither present nor in police custody. Furthermore, there is evidence in my possession that will clear my client without a shadow of a doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I intend to strip the artifice of this case away and reveal it for what it really is. Incompetence. Incompetence on the part of the Georgia Highway Patrol and an active witch hunt for my client. Make no mistake, his innocence will be proven by the ending of these proceedings. The little insect sauntered back to me like he was the biggest rooster on the yard, and I couldn't say he hadn't earned it. The retainer I had been forced to pay him was well worth the speech I had just heard. His eloquent words and well-presented facts had almost led me to believe I might be innocent. If I hadn't been the one who had choked that girl to death as she came out of the stall, I might have believed him myself. The trial proceeded slowly. The prosecution called Officer McGinnis to the stand, that big bulldog that worked for the Highway Patrol, who painted me as a thug and a drug mule. He told a tale of 7 other girls he had found dead all along Route 12 and 14. They had all died along my route, a route that was taken by many different people, but specifically me when I was making deliveries. Eyewitnesses said that I had interacted with several of these women, had been seen offering rides to 2 of them in fact. They had all been dumped along the side of the road near the truck stop where Emma Parker had been found strangled to death. My lawyer objected to this, claiming I had never been formally accused of these crimes, only a suspect before being released due to lack of evidence. Evidence. Pfft. As if they'd ever caught me with evidence. I wasn't an idiot. I burned their clothes, I cleaned my truck after every kill, and I never let anyone see me dumping the bodies. As a delivery driver, I keep weird hours. These hours are conducive to my work. Need to dump a body? 3 a.m. is an excellent time for it. Need to clean your truck out? Car washes with self-service areas are extremely empty before daylight. Need to burn something? A fire in the woods doesn't draw a great amount of attention early in the afternoon. I knew when the best times to dispose of evidence were, and the best ways to do it. I'd had a lot of practice. The judge let my lawyer's objection pass, wanting to know what this had to do with the case. The state's lawyer claimed motive and my alleged ties to the other murders. All the girls were young, 18 to 22, brunette, slim. This, he claimed, would prove that I had a type. Again, my lawyer claimed this was circumstantial, and the judge agreed. The officer exited the stand, and the attorney began his next gambit. I sat back comfortably, seeing this for the fishing expedition that it was. I snapped back to attention when I heard someone behind me laugh. I turned my head, seeing a pair of girls whispering to each other not too far off. Were they laughing at me? No one laughed at me. I had killed people for laughing at me. Emma Parker could have testified to that. She, as well as a few of the other deceased, knew it was a bad idea to laugh at me. My first victim, a girl in the 4th grade, had made that mistake and paid for it. One of the boys in my class had decided to pull my pants down in gym, displaying my tighty-whities for everyone to see. The whole class had laughed, but she had laughed loudest. Helen Darren, a brunette with pigtails that nearly touched her shoulders, had been red-faced and guffawing as I tried to pull my pants up, tears spilling down her face. Oh, but I'd had the last laugh, hadn't I? We took the same route home every day, and when I wrapped my hands around her throat and pulled her into the woods, her face turned red again. She fought some, but I had surprised her, and she wasn't as strong as I was. When she stopped moving, I hadn't known what to do initially, but I figured it out pretty quickly. I'd gotten lucky that time. A freak blizzard had befallen the county the next night, a blizzard in October of all things, and the winter that year was brutal. They hadn't found her until the snows thawed in May, and by that time, any evidence I might have left was gone. My lawyer's objections brought me back from my revelry. Objection, Your Honor. The evidence presented is counter to the accounts given by my client and the coroner. The coroner's report states that the head wound was old. She had received it before being picked up by the defendant. As such, the presence of blood and hair in the cab is circumstantial at best. The judge allowed it this time. Smarmy prick. But I had to say I was pretty impressed by this dweeb. He might have looked like a Simpsons character, but he had the heart of a lion somewhere under all of it. Who knew? Maybe I'd even let him buy me a beer once all this was over. Maybe I'd have even made him my next victim, if he wasn't a dark-haired dweeb. They trotted out some old lady who'd seen Emma get into my truck then. The bitch actually said, when my lawyer asked, that the head wound had been there when she saw her, so there went that little theory. I was just a good Samaritan, someone who helped people. Then they had found some attendant at a truck stop who saw me put her out, but also thought he saw my truck there too a few minutes later. I tried to play it cool, but that was news to me. I didn't think anyone had seen me double back, but if he had, he could screw up my whole trial. The laughter dragged its spidery legs across the back of my neck, and I jerked around to see who it was. The girls were looking forward, listening to the witness, and I couldn't see anyone else mugging back there. Who the hell was laughing? My life could be on the line, and someone was freaking laughing. I'd kill him. I'd choke the life out of him. No one laughed at me. No one laughed at... Mr. Miles, can you tell me the license plate on my client's vehicle? I turned around again. I hadn't even heard the dweeb move. The hick on the stand scratched his head and finally shook it. No, sir, I don't suppose I can. What does the defendant's truck look like? Well, it's a deep blue cab with a silver trailer. Thank you, Mr. Miles, for describing every truck in the LeMary fleet. Thank you for describing thousands of trucks on the road today. Did you see my client climb out of the truck? Well, no, Did you witness him strangle Mrs. Parker? The man seemed flustered. Jesus Christ, no, of course not. Then I move that this man's statement be expunged. He cannot properly identify my client's vehicle and did not witness the murder of Ms. Parker. The witness identified Mr. Murphy's truck from a lineup successfully. The prosecutor snapped back. The judge banged his gavel and told both of them to be quiet. I just smirked. This wasn't going well for them. So far, the prosecution was looking pretty incompetent, but that was to be expected. The whole operation had been pretty incompetent from the get-go. Through some eyewitness testimony, they had decided that I was a person of interest and brought me in for questioning. I had told them about my job, the amount of travel between my facility in Decatur and the surrounding area, and the hours that I often worked. As I sat there telling them little tidbits, they had no idea they had caught the killer and were getting ready to let him go. There was a lot of traffic up that route, a lot more trucks than just mine on the road, and after some probing questions and an inspection of my cab, they had no choice but to turn me loose. I had thought that would be the end of it. The prosecution trotted in a forensics expert, citing the blood and hair found in the back of my cab to be proof that I had been in possession of the body. I was trying to listen, but that skeletal snickering just rankled me. I suddenly turned my head, scaring some old blue hair behind me who was listening, and scanned the crowd for the source of the laughter. Nobody laughed at me. Emma had learned that, hadn't she? For the briefest of seconds, I thought I saw Emma, her brunette hair hanging limply and her face still purple and lifeless. But the person was gone a moment later. I jumped when my lawyer touched my arm. "Hey, be cool. The judge is looking at you. What the hell are you doing?" I looked, and sure enough, the judge was looking directly at me as the forensic guy made his case. I straightened myself as my lawyer rose to cross-examine, trying not to look as angry as I felt. After I'd killed Amber Hodges, I began to notice some extra scrutiny. Highway patrolmen followed me a little longer and seemed to show up when I was making deliveries. I lost several prospective victims because they were always sniffing around. You see, I never killed more than I strictly had to. Killers who got a body count always get sloppy in the end, and they tend to make mistakes. I'd killed maybe 1 in 10 girls that I picked up along that route. Some of them were hitchhikers, some of them had car trouble, but all of them were stranded and in need of a good Samaritan. I took them to gas stations, rest stops, wherever along my route they needed to go, or as close to where they needed to go as I could get. I killed some of them, but most of them got along and led normal lives. This was also to throw off the police, but it worked against me too. One of them had seen me pick up Amber Hodge, but they hadn't seen me put her back out again. Before I knew it, I was at the police station again. They had tied me, somehow, to several of the other girls. I had picked them up, but no one could confirm that I had dropped them off again. They had found many of the dump sites near my route, but had found no evidence tying me to the site. At this point, all they had to go by was the fact that I had picked them up, and since the officer hadn't bothered to follow me all day, they were forced to cut me loose. They found it very clear, though, that I was a person of interest in this case, and that made me cautious. I had gone 2 months before killing again, and Emma wasn't even intended to be my next victim. But she laughed at me, and that had forced my hand. My lawyer asked the forensics guy if he'd seen the body of Emma Parker. He said he had, and that it had been strangled to death with a belt left at the scene. My lawyer nodded and asked if he had seen the head wound that she had received earlier that day, a head wound that had not killed her. The forensic guy seemed a little taken aback by this, but said he was aware of the head wound. It was well documented, that head wound, so I figured he had been instructed not to bring it up unless he really had to. "And are you also aware that this head wound was not, in fact, the result of my client's actions, but the actions of her boyfriend, Chadwick Rolls?" The forensics guy nodded, looking defeated. "My client also allowed her to sleep in the back of his truck, which is why there was blood on the sleeper bed in the back. Ms. Parker laid her head down, getting the blood on it, and provided you with a reason to hassle my client." The prosecutor objected, but my lawyer abated and came to sit down. The prosecution rested then, and my lawyer rose to begin his own list of witnesses. His list was short, 2 people, and he was clearly looking for an easy win in an early day. I wanted to be mad about this, but honestly, I couldn't fault the guy. If he could get an easy win, why not take it? The courthouse was quiet as he called his first witness, and that was the only reason I heard the cluster of chuckles that erupted from the assembly of observers. I tried to ignore it, hearing them chatter and squawk, but it really galled me. How dare they laugh at me? I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to see their faces and make them regret ever having thought they could get away while laughing at me. I composed my face, though, seeing the judge watching me, but I felt an entirely irrational rage building in me. In a move that seemed to stun the crowd, the lawyer called Chadwick Rolls to the stand. Chadwick swaggered up to the stand, his polo shirt already stained as it strained against his sculpted chest. He had taken my lawyer's advice and not worn his cap, but still had a pair of expensive sunglasses nestled amongst his short brown hair. His khaki pants had been ironed and his shoes had been shined. He could almost pass for a respectable person. He looked miserable. My lawyer asked him to state his name, and the frat boy gave it as evenly as he could. I suspected he might be hungover, might even still be drunk, and found my anger bubbling again. The stupid punk couldn't have even stayed out of the bottle long enough to clear my name. This kid was playing with fire. My lawyer asked him about the events of the day in question. Chad told the story how he and Emma had been arguing. He may have pushed her a little against the window, and when she saw that she was bleeding, she had gotten out and refused to get back in. Chad had followed her for a while, telling her how sorry he was and to get back in, but she had refused and just kept walking up the side of the road. Chad had left then, not having time for her crap, and driven back to campus. He had heard the next day that she was missing. He had not seen her get into my truck. The prosecutor got up to cross-examine him, but there wasn't much to act on. Chad's whole reason for being there was to corroborate that he had been the one to hit her, not me. If he could prove that she had been wounded before she got in my truck, then it might help to cast doubt on my ability to have murdered anyone. My lawyer had promised amnesty for Chad if he helped us. The two had been fighting, and it wasn't as if Emma had filed a report or anything. He climbed off the stand and slouched away, shooting me a dark look as he passed. Guess he was mad I'd axed his ex. Then, it was my turn to take the stand. The crowd murmured when I was called, but I climbed up to the box as though I hadn't a care in the world. I smiled out at them as I sat there, already confident that I would be going home tonight, and on the hunt again by tomorrow. This would be like a good roller coaster, hours of wasted time for a 5-minute ride, followed by the exhilaration of escape. I could already taste my freedom. Mr. Murphy, in your own words, could you tell us what happened on the day in question? I found her walking along the side of the road alone. She looked drug out and kept sliding her hands up to hold her head. She fit my profile, pretty, brunette, young, but I had already decided not to kill her. I pulled up next to her and offered her a ride. She had been hesitant, and I thought for a second that she might refuse me, but she nodded and climbed in as we rumbled on. We rode together for a little while, her joking and smiling despite her wounds, and me teasing and flirting good-naturedly. I felt her looking at me sometimes, not uncommon for women to do, and we'd been driving for about half an hour when she asked if she could lie down in the back. Her head was a tacky mess of blood, and I gave her a bottle of water to clean the wound in the little washroom off the sleeper cab. She came out a little wet, but her hair was free of the blood. She smiled, swishing her hips a little for me to see, and climbed into the sleeper cab. When I'd pulled over a few minutes later, I figured I could surprise her with a little more than flirting. I saw Miss Parker walking up the side of the road and offered her a ride. She agreed. After riding for a while, she asked to use my sleeper so she could rest. After about a half hour, she came back out and asked if I'd drop her off at the Decatur rest stop. I parked and let her out. She thanked me and walked towards the visitor's center. I pulled out of the parking lot and left the rest stop. That was the last I saw of her. She had come awake when I'd straddled her, her eyes coming open suddenly. I ran a hand against her, her jeans already left outside the sleeper, but I didn't receive the fear I was hoping for. She looked worried for half a heartbeat, but then she smirked and lifted a hand to her mouth. That was when I realized that my little problem had flared up again. It did from time to time, and I stumbled off her as she sat up a bit. "I would have let you have a go if you'd asked, handsome," she said teasingly, "but it looks like you're, not quite ready for action." Then she laughed, and it took everything I had not to kill her right there. "And did you at any time enter the rest stop?" "No," I answered. She had still been smiling when we pulled up to the rest stop parking lot. "Thanks for the lift, handsome. And don't worry, I won't tell anybody about your performance issues." As I watched her move towards the welcome center, I knew it would be the last laugh she ever had. I parked the truck up the road about a half a mile and turned on the hazard lights. I was back at the rest stop in no time. I snuck up, not wanting to be seen, and watched her step into the bathroom through the glass window of the welcome center. The woman behind the counter was missing, and I took advantage of her absence to slip into the bathroom unseen. She was in a stall by the door, pants around her ankles, humming to herself. I noticed a sign on the wall, closed for cleaning, and slipped it onto the door. I wanted to kick the door open and throttle her, but instead, I stepped into the adjoining stall and pulled my own pants down, waiting. She was out again in a few minutes, but the wait seemed to stretch on forever. I pulled my pants up as the water ran, and when I stepped up, she looked up and saw me. She smiled and turned to ask what was going on. Her smile died about a moment before she did. She tried to break my hold, but when I bowed her over the sink, she knew she couldn't stop me. Her gasping sounded like laughing, her mouth laughing her life away as I choked her. That made me madder, my fingers gripping her throat and leaving deep bruises. The capillaries in her eyes burst as she tried to fight me off, and when she finally went limp, I went right on squeezing for a few more minutes. I left her on the bathroom floor like a discarded condom, shimmying out the window near the back. I was in my truck and driving away before an hour had passed. The judge looked at the prosecutor, but he shook his head, knowing he had nothing to add. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy. You may step down." I stood to leave and felt my legs turn to water beneath me. She was there. She was sitting on the front row staring at me, grinning her too wide smile and her bloody eyes looking right through me. The judge was saying something, telling me to get off the stand, but I couldn't. I was mouthing wordlessly, my lawyer giving me a flinty look that said plainly that he wanted me to get off the stand. I couldn't. I could see the purple marks pulsing around her neck as her skin became mottled and bruised. "You," I whispered, the bailiff approaching as I continued to waffle up there. "Come on, handsome. Come get what you wanted back in the truck," she hissed, wiggling her chest as her skin turned from pale flower to something like a bruised peach. "No one will make fun of your little problem where we're going," she purred, chuckling in that mechanical way that she had chuckled all day. The laughter rankled me, laying on my skin like a dead fish, and I realized that it had been her all day. She had been sitting behind me, laughing at me, knowing that I would lose even before I began. "You bitch!" I yelled, fighting against the bailiff as he tried to drag me out of the box. "Don't you laugh at me. Don't you ever laugh at me. I killed you. I watched you die. You'll never laugh at anyone again. I won. I killed you," I screamed. The bailiff finally succeeded in dragging me away, my ranting still spewing like sludge from a pipe. The laughter began to echo around me as I was dragged off, the courtroom erupting as the judge banged his gavel for silence. I could see her changing as they drug me away, the courtroom beginning to fill with black slimed creatures before the door to the court banged shut and cut them off from view. That was 6 months ago. I had to write this down today, just to be sure I wouldn't forget it. When someone came to get me after the trial, it was to take me to a place even worse than prison, even worse than death row. They took me to a man in a nice suit who asked me about the courtroom. I told the truth. I told him about the creatures. I told him about Emma and that she had sat on the front row and turned into one of them. I told him about the laughter that I could still hear vibrating on the back of my skull. He wrote it all down, smiling placidly, before looking up and nodding knowingly. "Well, sounds like you're not going to prison after all, Mr. Murphy." I won't?" I asked, almost sheepishly. "Oh no, sounds as though you've had a nervous breakdown. We can't let you go to prison in your current mental state." That's how I came to be here, sitting in the day room, wearing a gown instead of a jumpsuit, watching Sesame Street with these drooling morons instead of waiting for the needle to make the laughing go away. The monsters are here too. They move amongst them and make their laughter sound more like screams. They walk the halls, and none of the orderlies or doctors see them. They live amongst us, and I'm beginning to think that we might be their food. They won't touch me. Why won't they touch me? They just look at me with their sightless eyes and move on to the next one. They leave me to dwell within the pits as I listen to the laughter that only exists in an insane asylum. They leave me to go mad amongst the laughter of hell. I sat across from him, looking into the eyes of this insane, sane young man, and wondering why I was here. "Mr. Murphy, do you know why I'm here today? I've been a therapist for nearly 15 years, and I like to think that I've seen a lot in that time. Every therapist has war stories. The clients you help and the situations that sprang from them create a rich tapestry that you can really only talk about with other therapists. I've worked with the police for the last 5 years, creating profiles and helping them get in the minds of serial killers and other undesirables. It's fascinating work, but this was the first time I'd ever been called to a case like this. I'd been called by the police to prove the guilt of a man found too insane to stand trial in the first place. You're here to prove that I'm competent enough to be put to death." He said this as though he were saying he wanted a Coke and a Big Mac for dinner that evening. I sat across from him, making notes on my steno pad as he rattled his chains and sat attached to a chair that had been welded to the ground. The staff clearly felt he was a danger to me, but I felt no less safe with him than I had with any other client. Patients rarely try to hurt their therapists, despite it being a bit of a trope. Patients usually see us as a surrogate father or a missing source of attention that they ultimately strive for. Less than 30% of patients ever try to hurt their doctor, and in my circle, It was less than 10% among therapists that I knew. I was about to become part of that minority, though I didn't know it yet. I turned on my tape recorder and sat it between us. "Are you sane enough to be punished for your crimes, Mr. Murphy?" The man sat accused of killing 7 young women before his breakdown in court. He sat across from me as placid as a mackerel. He looked very different from the mugshot that was in his file. His crew cut had been replaced with a short, bristly buzz cut, and his suit was now no better than pajamas and house slippers. On his contemporaries, these garments looked like the trappings of a mental defect, but on Murphy they appeared as natural as the pajamas he might wear at home. He wore them comfortably. They did not hang off of him as though they were only there to cover his modesty. Had I not heard the tapes from his trial, tapes found after the incident, I would have thought a great miscalculation had been made. If I were the judge and this man was in my courtroom, I would have probably set him loose again. "As sane as you are," he stated, smiling a little as he said it. "And yet, the doctors here are certain that you suffer from the same delusions you claimed to suffer from 8 months ago. If seeing things that I know are real is a delusion, then I guess I still do, yes." I made a note of that before turning back to him. "You're referring to the smiling shadows?" I asked, trying not to smile when I said it. Crazy people rarely take kindly to being mocked, even if it's just something insinuated from the tone of voice. "If that's what you choose to call them, then yes," he answered haughtily. "What do you call them, Mr. Murphy?" He looked at me steadily, and I felt a little shiver run through me as he held eye contact. Those piercing blue eyes that held me had probably watched 7 women die. They call themselves the Gallery, and I can assure you that they are very real. When was the first time you saw this Gallery? At the trial. They came to mock me. The Gallery was present at your trial, I asked. No one was really aware of what had happened at the trial, except for Mr. Murphy and the bailiff who had come to remove him. They had been the only 2 survivors that day, 30 people having died in what the police were calling a gas leak, though it seemed to be a little too cleanly nipped up for me. This wasn't the first time Murphy had spoken of these smiling shadows, and maybe if they could break through the delusion, some new information on the perpetrator could be discovered. The Gallery was there, yes, but I was unaware of them until the very last. When my last victim stood up just as I was leaving the stand, that was the first time I became aware that the Gallery was there at all. The entire courtroom began to fill with their terrible laughter, and that was when I snapped. No one laughs at me. That last bitch could have told you that, but when she came up out of the crowd, came up laughing at me, I couldn't take it anymore. That was when you gave your confession of sorts, I asked. Yeah, I guess you could say that, he said begrudgingly. I had heard the tapes from the courtroom myself. He had gone from polite and articulate to a frothing berserker in the course of a few seconds. He admitted to everything. He admitted to killing her, told them how she laughed at him, and his ranting had hit a fever pitch as he was dragged from the courtroom. The judge had tried to call for order, but a soft titter of laughter could be heard from the stand just before the tape had abruptly gone off. Had the gas had some effect on Mr. Murphy's mental state, perhaps? Had he inhaled just enough to make him go off the rails as he was being led away? You still don't believe that I saw them, though, do you? He asked. I shrugged at him. Are you seeing them now? I am, actually, he said, looking at the corner just over my shoulder. In fact, this was their idea. The Gallery wants you to be sent to death row, I asked skeptically. As a matter of fact, they do, and so do I. They want me to be sent there so badly that they're willing to break their cardinal rule. Oh, and what might that be? Apparently, they don't just appear to anyone, Mr. Murphy said. They're very selective about who they choose to reveal themselves to. That time, though, is coming to an end. They're getting ready to show themselves to the whole world, but there are still places that are hard for them to get to. Old places. Places of power. Places where they gain more power. If I have to trade my life, a life outside of this nut house, then I will do so gladly. I nearly scoffed at him. What leads you to believe that I will find you sane? With this sort of behavior you're displaying, I think this place might be the best spot for you. Because you're not a man of faith, are you, Doc? You're a man of facts. And there's no way that you could keep me here in good conscience if you knew they were real. In that highly unlikely situation, I suppose you're right, I said. Well then, Doc, I guess I've just got one request. I looked up curiously with dread for what it was he meant to ask me. Turn around and say hello. He was smiling as he pointed to the corner behind him, and I snorted a little laugh, deciding to play along with him. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see nothing more than an excuse to leave him in the puzzle factory for a good long time. I never guessed that I would see a reason to admit myself sitting in that corner. My steno pad fell to the ground, making a sharp clack as it did so. It was hunched in the corner, down on all fours and leering at me in a perverse way. Though the lights were on, it almost seemed to exist in a pool of murky light. Its smooth, dark head was devoid of eyes, its nostrils looking like they had been bored with a power tool. Its arms ended in long claws, its legs in a toadish splay of feet, but its teeth were the worst. Its grin was skinned back, no lips to cover those shiny white teeth, and they looked almost too big for its head. Though it never opened its jaws, I could hear it emitting a low chuckle, like a laugh track in a sitcom. The laughter was perverted, unclean, like the owner was just making the sound because it knew that people were supposed to like laughter. It sounded like the laughter of brains too mad to comprehend laughter properly. Sounds like the laughter you hear in hell, don't it, Doc? Murphy asked, and I jumped as I remembered that he was still there. How? How did you do that? I asked, unable to take my eyes off the creature. Me? Oh no, you don't seem to understand. They live here. They like this place. They can rattle the chimes of anybody in here for as long as they need to, and get whatever it is they live off from us. Fortunately for me, they can't or won't do it. I won't work as food for them, so they decided to make a deal. They whisper to me at night, telling me what I have to do, and so I've done it. Now you know I'm not crazy. You know that I'm as sane as any other inmate in Stragview. You can't, in good conscience, leave me here with these normal crazy people. I might take advantage of them, or hurt them like I hurt those girls. He smiled as he said it. That smile told me all I needed to know about Murphy. He was as sane as any garden variety sociopath, and he belonged with his own kind. Still, I really didn't want to give him what he wanted. What if I told him that you are insane, and that you have to... The shadowy thing was in my ear, a clawed finger sliding over my throat as it breathed oozy words into my unwilling ear. Then we drive you to this place some night, and let him make you his next victim. Murphy shrugged. It's not as if I can't convince someone else to sign off on the paperwork. Why not save yourself a lot of trouble, hey, Doc? As I lay here in my bed, after having escaped that hellish place, I can't help but shake as I remember my weakness. He smiled at me as they let him out, thanking me for getting him out of there. He went away pretty meekly for a man going to the needle. It didn't change things, though. They may not be waiting for me in the dark corners of my room, but I can still see their grinning faces when I close my eyes. As I left, I saw them all around me, milling about, making their way between their charges. I can't unsee them, but I'm afraid they will haunt my mind forever. Maybe I'll stop seeing them once they drag me away to the nut house, but it sounds like my only respite may be at the end of a needle too.
I had been at Stragview for about 2 years, but only stationed in J-Dorm for a few months. Murphy was going to be my first execution. After spending some time shuffling through one dorm or another, I was glad to finally have a permanent station, even if it was the death house. J-Dorm had a bad reputation, and I was one in a long line of officers to work there.
It would just be me and Sergeant Banks, who'd been in J-Dorm for a whole 6 months longer than me, and the two of us had spent the last couple of weeks following a chore list and making small talk. With no charges to house and watch, we were not given orderlies to clean for us. So it was, day in and day out, that we cleaned cells, mopped floors, and made sure every nook and cranny was spotless, just in case someone important should come down. When someone did, it was to tell us that our first inmate would be arriving on Wednesday. When I saw that it was Alex Murphy, the murderer from the TV, I was excited. He'd murdered all those women, and then been the only survivor of his own trial, besides the bailiff who'd escorted him out. The CCTV footage had cut out just as he'd been drug out of the courtroom, and hadn't come back on for about 10 minutes. When it had, the whole courtroom had been nothing but bodies slumped over seats and lying in aisles. No one had been wounded. No one had been harmed in any way. The coroner had said it was asphyxiation, their stomach muscles making him think that they either laughed or screamed themselves to death. The Alex Murphy that had been dragged out of that courtroom was very different from the one I saw let in now. I was standing at the J-Dorm doors and saw him led up the center road by a pair of officers at his arms, and 4 more hovering around like an honor guard. The yard had been cleared before he'd been allowed past the center gate, but the warden was clearly taking no chances. The state paid big bucks for housing and eliminating death row inmates, and the warden did not want Murphy's death to be premature. I stepped back inside, standing by the door to his temporary home, cell open and spotless. I thought to myself that he was much smaller than he had been on TV. Murphy was barely 5 feet in his prison crocs, and didn't look like a man prone to visiting the gym. You'd have never thought a guy like that would be capable of doing the things he'd done, but I suppose that anything was possible. His honor guard stayed outside, and the 2 officers who'd let him in took him to the door of his cell. He bent down then, knees on the tile floor, as they removed his ankle chains. As he stood up, I put a hand on my gas, expecting that this would be when the trouble would start. He would come charging up, spitting and lunging and trying to get one last shot in before the doors closed. He was good at hiding it, but I'd get a good look at the lion who mauled those women just before I coated his eyes in hot gas. Instead, he stepped inside and let me run the door closed, stepping close to the door so I could unlock the black box chain. Once unlocked, he sat down on his bunk, arms slack and legs slightly spread, and began staring at the wall like it might give him an answer. I passed the desk, taking the black box and chains to the storeroom, as Sarge went to talk to Murphy. He introduced himself, telling him what he could expect while he was here. Turns out that all Sergeant Banks really wanted was for him to be quiet, eat his meals, take his shower every night, and not give him any trouble until it was time for him to get the injection. I heard most of this as I sat at the desk going over paperwork. Our desk was on the floor, so we could look down the row of 8 cells, and as Sarge came back up the row, I saw he was shaking his head. He blew out a breath like a horse as he sat down, dragging Murphy's file over as he prepared to fill out the appropriate bits. "Man, this guy is spooky," he said, shivering at the words. "What do you mean?" I said, looking up from the logs. "I mean, usually when you're giving an inmate the welcome to my dorm and don't screw up speech, they nod or talk or something. Murphy just sat there, staring at the wall. Didn't even acknowledge I was there." You think it's an act?" Banks shrugged. "Guess we'll see." Our shift was unique amongst the Stagview staff. Banks and I were on 12-hour shifts, but instead of 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., we were 8 to 8. We arrived, fed breakfast at 8:30, cleaned, watched our charges, conducted rec twice a week in the cage out back, passed out laundry, fed lunch at 1, handed out mail, handled call-outs or doctor visits, showered at 6, fed dinner at 7, and handed the reins over to Officer Kutch and Officer Danzy, who kept watch through the night. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I worked by myself, so Banks could have a day off. On Mondays and Wednesdays, Banks worked by himself, so that I could have a day off. We would do this for 6 months. Then we would be asked if we wanted to continue, if the need arose. When we had no charges, I was cycled back to the compound, and Banks would hold it down by himself. It was supposed to be tedious work for the most part. The first day is the only time I remember it being boring. We spent the first day filling out paperwork and being ignored by Murphy. I pushed a bag lunch through the flap at noon, but he just kept sitting there staring at the wall. I asked if he wanted rec, but he ignored me in favor of the wall. After asking a few times, I finally just walked off and went about my business. As I walked towards the desk, I thought for a moment that a small shadow moved beside the leg of the chair I was about to plop down in. I shook it off and got back to work. J-Dorm was old, built out of cinder blocks back in the 50s, and it had a lot of weird shadows and shrouded areas. I got back to my paperwork, pushing the thoughts away as Banks hummed tunelessly on the desk beside me. When I offered Murphy a shower later, I noticed the bag was still on the floor, and he was still staring at the wall. I just walked off, not wanting to get between him and whatever bug or stain he was watching. I told Banks we should call medical to look at him, but he waved it off. The guy, he said, had been here less than 24 hours. He'd spent the last 8 months in the puzzle factory, and had been found sane enough to be put to death. He had no lawyer, wanted no appeal, had been sent here after driving his therapist insane. You'd probably be a little funny too, with a track record like that, Banks told me. When I slid his lunch bag in an hour later, I winced as it crinkled against the first bag. When Officer Kutch came to relieve us, I told him about Murphy and suggested he keep an eye on him. Banks was already at the door, trying to get home to see the end of the baseball game, and Kutch said that he would let me know if anything changed. I left with Banks, and we parted ways in the parking lot. I went home, ate dinner, and went to bed, knowing I'd be up at 6 a.m. so I could be at my post by 8. When Kutch called me at 10, I rolled over groggily and grabbed my phone. "Hello?" "Hey, it's Kutch." I could tell that something was off right away. "Thought you guys told me this guy was catatonic." I rolled up on an elbow, wiping sleep from my eyes as I pressed the phone against my cheek with my shoulder. "Not exactly. He's just not all there, I think. He spent the whole day staring at a spot on the wall. Well, he spent all night laughing. Like, creepy laughing. Listen." I heard dead air for a moment, but there was something over the air. When I picked up on the little echoing titter, I wondered if he were watching TV at the station. I wondered how he had managed to sneak a cell phone in or a portable TV through security, since we had no computers. "You hear it, right?" Kutch asked, coming back on. "It's been happening all night. It's not even really laughter, it's that damned canned laughter, like on a sitcom. Every time I yell at him to cut that shit out, he's just sitting there staring at the wall. I'm going to leave an extermination order for Henderson to get a crew down here too. Can you get Banks to sign off on it?" "Exterminator? What needs exterminating?" I asked groggily. "Pretty sure we got rats, buddy. I've been seeing little things scurrying around all night. They seem to like Murphy's cell. I guess maybe they were living there before he arrived?" I made an agreeable noise at him, but I hadn't noticed any vermin leavings at all. We'd cleaned those cells top to bottom, and I'd never seen so much as a piss puddle or scatter of mouse turds. It was a recent occurrence if he was seeing rats, but I made a note to get Henderson down there with some poison tomorrow. I told him good night and went back to sleep. Kutch looked a little rattled when he handed us his log the next day. Good luck with that guy. All he does is chuckle, just softly chuckles to himself on and off all night. I never catch him doing it either. It's real sporadic and never seems to fit a pattern or anything. I'm going to bed. I'll see you two tonight. We spent that whole day much the same as we had the one before. I offered him lunch, but it landed on last night's bag when I pushed it in. I offered him rec, but he refused to acknowledge me. We offered him a shower. He continued to stare at the wall. When I slid his dinner in,
I watched as it tumbled down the other 4 that were still in front of the door. He was still sitting in the same position, the same place he'd been when we'd brought him in, and I honestly wondered if medical needed to come have a look at him. Sarge just said that he would eat when he was hungry, and that he must have been drinking because he hadn't passed out yet. When Kutch came in to relieve us that night, I left thinking that Murphy would never make it to execution day. He would starve to death long before that. By the end of the first week, we had opened the door to sweep the unopened bags out into the hallway for disposal. Medical agreed to come see him, but they never showed up. This was pretty common, and I remembered how hard it was to get inmates seen by medical in confinement if they weren't actively bleeding to death. Murphy went right on staring, right on not speaking, and it appeared that Kutch had been right about the rats. The death house was full of shadowy corners, and I would stop several times a day to squint at a moving shadow or a skittering something that moved just out of sight. They always seemed to operate at the corners of my eyes, just out of sight or wavering in a dark corner that would be empty when I arrived. I found it odd because rats were supposed to be nocturnal. Why were they moving around in the middle of the day? Henderson had been twice and still had found no rat spoor or found a single one in his trap. Speaking of Kutch, the man was not doing well. The circles under his eyes were becoming bags, and he looked haggard when he came to relieve us in the morning. He told us that he would see shadows moving around throughout the night, and still hear the laughter when he closed his eyes. It had gotten so bad that he had stopped sleeping altogether. He told us he hadn't slept in 4 days, and it was clearly affecting him. Danzy hadn't reported much, but I had a sneaking suspicion that Danzy was sneaking a phone in somehow, and spending his nights with his earbuds in and his mind on other things. It seemed that Kutch was the only one getting the full brunt of Murphy's strangeness. I looked up down the hallway 2 nights ago, wanting to yell at him, and saw something standing outside his door looking in. It looked like a person, like a hunched man, and when I got up to yell at it, it looked back at me, and I could see something like a smiling shadow looking in on him. I shone my flashlight at it, wanting a better look at it, but it was gone. I think it's what's been scuttling around at night. I don't know, man. I'm so tired. We brushed it off, but then a new visitor came to see us that evening. When the doors opened, we thought it might be Weiner, who had come to chat on his rounds. Weiner was the latest confinement sergeant to take up the mantle. He used his security checks of G-Dorm's gate as an excuse to come pass a coffee break with us. We hadn't bothered to look up from our paperwork when the door opened, until someone cleared their throat near the desk. That's when we realized it wasn't our usual nighttime nuisance. It was the warden. The warden of Stragview was an interesting fella. He had looked exactly the same for as long as anyone could remember. Short salt and pepper hair, pinstripe suit, black polished shoes, gold-rimmed glasses, and a build somewhere between underfed and athletic. He smiled his usual Cheshire Cat grin at us, and I tried not to shudder as it fell on me. He had always kind of creeped me out, his intense gaze and a creepy smile kind of giving me the willies. People said he had moved his office into the tower, the steel-gray edifice that sat in the middle of the compound. It was rumored to be full of aggressive and territorial rats, and I couldn't think of anyone who would actually want to stay there. Still, if he had actually moved into the tower, I supposed he had taken care of them somehow. Banks sat up a little straighter as the man loomed over his desk. "Warden, to what do we owe the pleasure?" "Just came to have a chat with our newest charge. I like to have a chat with our death house charges from time to time. You never know what you can hear from the lips of the damned." Banks loosed an uncomfortable little laugh, but I kept my head down and kept at my paperwork. Sounded pretty weird to me. "Let me go escort you down the—" "I think I can find him, Sergeant Banks. Loan me your keys. I won't be long." Banks seemed hesitant to give him the keys, but what could you do? The guy was the warden, the one who signed your paychecks. When he tells you to hand over your keys, you hand them over. Banks gave him the keys, and the warden made his way down to Murphy's cell. He looked in,
turned the key, and stepped inside without a backwards glance. I looked towards the door for a few minutes before voicing my concerns, and I could see Banks shooting furtive glances as he tried to get on with his paperwork. Should one of us maybe have gone with him? I finally asked. Banks shrugged, but it looked forced. He said he knew the way. He's in there with an unrestrained inmate. If he gets hurt, and they see us just sitting here doing nothing, it'll be our jobs. Banks furrowed his brow, but finally shook it off and went back to his paperwork. We don't question the warden. It's best to just let him do what he's here to do. That seemed to settle the matter. He was still there an hour later when I went to drop off Murphy's dinner bag. As I approached, I could hear a low but very angry voice hissing from under Murphy's door. It didn't carry well, and if I hadn't been right there, I likely wouldn't have heard it. The warden seemed to be haranguing Murphy for something, and Murphy was saying nothing in response. I know you've brought them here, young man. I know they walk the halls of my prison, and if I find that you've brought them here, I'll make what the state can do to you look like a slap on the wrist. I peeked through the glass window on the front and saw the warden looming over Murphy as he sat placidly on his bunk. He was unaware of the warden as he was of us, and I could see how much that infuriated the man. His hands seemed to itch to grab Murphy, to shake him until whatever grievance he thought Murphy guilty of rattled out of his placid head. Instead, he took a step towards the door, eyes still on Murphy, and I scuttled back a little so he wouldn't notice me. Think over what I've said. Your execution date might be approaching, but I can assure you it doesn't have to be the end of you. He turned, surprised when he came out and saw me in the hall. Just bringing Murphy his dinner, I said, holding up the bag for him to see. The warden seemed unimpressed. He isn't hungry. Get back to your work, officer. He pressed the sergeant's keys into my chest and took his leave. Dansey came to relieve us an hour later, and the two of us took our leave. The next day was one of my solo days, and when Dansey wasn't at his post that morning, I knew something was up. Dansey was unreliable, kind of a shitty officer, and this wouldn't be the first time I had arrived to find the post unmanned. His log was gone, though, and his keys were in the box, so I figured I just missed him on the way out that morning and started my day. I didn't think too much about it. The day's activities kept my mind on the job until 8:30 the next night, when he still hadn't arrived. Dansey was unreliable, but he liked to get paid, and he was always on time. I called the control room and asked if he'd come in. That's weird. He's a no-call, no-show, but he also never clocked out this morning. Did he say anything when he relieved you last night? No, but he wasn't at his post this morning when I got here. The control room officer made a weird noise in her throat. Well, let me make some calls and see if I can get someone to cover for you. I set the phone in the cradle and started the paperwork for whoever was coming in. It wasn't a very long list. If Dansey wasn't here, then Kutch would have to come in. It was a pretty short list of guys who could work in J-Dorm. You had to have special classes on dealing with higher custody inmates. Even though we only had the one inmate, we had specific guidelines that we had to follow. As I sat filling out paperwork, however, I got my first taste of the mysterious laughter. I was making a note of the night's count and rounds when I first heard the light, tinny laughter scuttle up the hallway. I looked up to find the long, dark passageway empty, the cell doors looming like open mouths, except for Murphy's. I went back to what I'd been doing. Someone was probably leaning against the G-Dorm fence, smoking and laughing at a joke, and I'd just caught an echo. When I heard it again, though, I stood up and called out down the hallway. Was someone playing a joke on me? Surely Dansey wouldn't have hidden all day just to play some elaborate prank. Would he? I stood up and walked down the hall, looking in the empty cells to be sure I was alone, except for Murphy. I checked in on him and found him still sitting in the same place he had been all week. He never blinked, never moved, just sat there on the bed and stared at the wall, like his mind had snapped. I went back to the desk, intending to finish the start-of-shift paperwork, when I heard the phone ring. I got excited for a minute, expecting good news. I should have known better in a place like this. "Hey, buddy, it's Captain Govil. Listen, I hate to ask, but I'm going to have to get you to stay till Baker gets here this morning. I'll come talk to you in the morning about it, okay?" I breathed out harshly. "Not really, boss. I've been at work for going on 14 hours. If I stay the night, I'll have been here for 24 hours, which I'll get in a lot of trouble for. Don't worry about that. Warden says we can work something out there. Officer Kutch isn't answering his phone, and we can't get up with Officer Danzy at all. You're the only one as of now, other than Baker, who can work in J-Dorm. And if these two don't come in tomorrow, we may have to move your schedules around for the next few weeks. I really need you to help me out, buddy. Can you do it?" I told him I didn't seem to have much of a choice, and he thanked me and hung up. At that point, I figured I'd have a nap during the wee hours of the night, and to hell with who found out. Clearly they couldn't fire me. I was suddenly very important. It sounded like I might need to get used to working nights from now on. How naive I was back then. An hour later, the laughter rattled down the hall again, and I yelled at Murphy to shut up. In answer, the laughter cackled out across the dorm, and it sounded louder this time. I looked up again, about to shout a little harder, when I found my face inches from an inky something with a wicked smile. I yelped and fell backwards, upsetting my chair and falling hard on my back. I blinked, my head smacking the floor, and rolled out from under the desk as I sprang to my feet. My legs shook a bit as I rose up, and my vision was kind of blurry as I snapped my eyes around to see what the hell had scared me. But there was nothing there. I walked around with my light, snapping it into cells and looking for anything out of the ordinary. As I walked, I imagined I could see something moving out of the corner of my eye. I would turn quickly, trying to catch whatever it was, but it would always be gone when I looked up. Murphy sat through it all, staring and staring as I checked the corners of his cell for whatever I was looking for, I guess. Spent the rest of the night at my desk, eyes looking around, paperwork forgotten. When the captain and Baker walked in the next morning, it was a relief. That was until I got the news that I'd been dreading. "Baker will take the daytime operations from now on, and you'll have to take the nights for the foreseeable future. Danzy hasn't been home since he left work yesterday, and Kutch's wife says he left yesterday night and hasn't come home either. I'll see if we can push this paperwork on the quick so we can get a date of execution for Murphy. Shouldn't be that hard. The man has no lawyer to speak on his behalf, so I'm guessing his appeals are about spent. Until then, we'll be approving overtime for the two of you, so go home and get some sleep, and come back tonight ready to stay up." That's how I got stuck in the death house after dark, every night for the foreseeable future. The first 3 nights were hell. Every round I would see shadows creeping in and out of the cells, or up and down the hallway just outside my flashlight beam. I stood in the hall and searched each cell, afraid that if I stepped in for a closer look, the door would slam shut and I'd be stuck. After the incident at my desk, the little scuttling thing made no effort to hide. I'd see them lingering in the corners, disappearing when my beam fell on them, and leaning out the cells so I could shuffle over to investigate. The laughing, however, was by far the worst. The sound was insectile, scrambling up the halls and across my consciousness every night. I began to understand what Kutch was talking about, and by the 3rd night, I would dream about the hallway and the laughter all day. It would chase me up the hallways, the dark little smiling creatures chasing me through my dreams, and I would wake up with the covers tangled around me and my sheets soaked in sweat. It all came to a head on the 4th night on the ward. I was sitting at the desk, filling out paperwork, getting ready to walk my hourly round, when the lights suddenly went out. This was not out of the ordinary. The electric chair had made the power grid in the death house very unreliable. With everything that had been going on, though, it was enough to send a chill up my spine. The air conditioner cut off, my desk fan stopped spinning, and I was left in a sea of darkness. I reached for my flashlight, just as the grating laughter erupted up the hallway. I swung the beam around, trying to remember where the fuse box was as I checked the cell doors. I knew it was somewhere near the back, in the room where the electric chair used to be, and I checked the cells along the way as I walked towards the end of the block. I would find the fuse box, reset the breaker, and get the lights back on. Nothing to it. Piece of cake. When I heard the cringing, canned laughter scamper up the block on mouse feet, I shuddered all over. When one of the doors slammed shut suddenly, it was behind me. I swung around and saw the door to cell 1 still twitching a little in its frame. When I came up to Murphy's door, checking inside to make sure he was still there, I found him staring at the spot on the wall like he'd always been. As my beam stayed on him, though, I became aware of a different noise. It wasn't laughing, it wasn't chuckling, and it certainly wasn't that generic soundtrack of mirth I'd begun to dread. It was a plopping, like a drip from a faucet. As I watched, I saw the saliva drip from Murphy's slack mouth, soon to be followed by another one. In the light of my flashlight, it seemed to be black as tar as it shivered into the puddle on the floor. When he turned his head, his lips lifted in a grotesque smile. I could see the tar bubbling from between his teeth like a water hose. It cascaded down his prison shirt, staining the fabric black as it puddled in his lap. He heaved, beginning to giggle as the tar burbled from his throat, his neck bulging as the gob slid out of him. As it puddled on the floor, I could see it taking shape, and it began to rise and pulsate as the ooze lifted into a gelatinous man-thing. It looked like a human ink stain, and when the smile creased its face, I heard Murphy's watery laughter explode out like a burst pipe. He sounded like a person laughing in an insane asylum. He sounded like someone laughing in hell. I couldn't remember when I started running, but I could almost hear that black tide behind me. The water spilled from him. Was it water? Or was it ink? I could hear it slapping against the floor, flowing into the empty cells, and slamming the doors shut behind it as it chased me down the hall. I entered the execution room a second before it, the door crashing shut behind me like a cannon shot. I spun the light around frantically, looking for the box, and finding it just behind the old executioner's grate. The man who threw the switch had once stood there, and now I leapt behind it and threw the panel open. I flipped the breakers at random, hearing pops and seeing sparks, and when my boots became sodden, I started flipping them a little less at random. It crept up my legs, and I felt hands grabbing my knees as it rose. I dropped my flashlight in the panic, and it looked like a light shone through a blanket as it descended into the muck. It rose up my waist, my sides, and had just come up under my armpits when I threw the right switch, and the light shone to life with a vibrant hum. I was standing in a brightly lit room, my flashlight on the ground, and not a drop of liquid to be found. I walked hesitantly back to my desk, looking in on Murphy to find him staring at the wall with a clean uniform on, and I sat down to wait for daylight. I was intent on quitting when Baker got there. This is undoubtedly what had driven Kutch crazy, maybe even what had disappeared Danzy, and I wasn't going to spend another night being freaked out by this crap. I'd written up my resignation letter on the back of a log, and as the sun crept up, I prepared to hand it to my boss. Maybe they would just reassign me, I hoped, and not right out fire me. I needed this job, and the thought of losing out on a career was enough to make me rethink it. Even so, I wasn't about to have another night like last night. I stood up as Baker entered, letter in hand, but he never gave me a chance. "Great news. They moved his execution date up. It'll be this Wednesday. God, I didn't know how much longer I could do these 7-day work weeks. But only 2 more days. A night for you, I suppose. Think you can handle that, partner?" He looked so relieved that our 7-day work weeks were almost over that I folded the paper up and put it in my pocket. 1 more night. Yeah, I believed I could handle that. Little did I know that the main event was yet to come. As Banks and I came to get Murphy, officers Register and Marks accompanying us, I couldn't help but reflect on the night before. He was still sitting on his bunk, the indention he would leave likely to be the only lasting proof he was ever there at all. When we told him to come get cuffed up, he obeyed meekly. The black box went on, his hands shackled before him, and when the door opened, Murphy looked the picture of a dullard. I could see a small glob of peanut butter at the corner of his mouth, the only meal I had ever seen him eat while he was here, and Banks wiped it with a napkin before he led him down the hall towards the killing floor. As he walked, I couldn't help but think about the night before. The night before Murphy's execution had been eventful, but not in the way I had expected. I hadn't wanted to work another night in the death house, but after seeing how excited Banks was for the end of our 7-day work weeks, I couldn't cheat him by quitting on him. I smiled and told him that sounded good before grabbing my stuff and heading home. The last thing I wanted to do was sleep right now, but I knew I would need some rest if I was coming back tonight. I would need my wits about me for the final night. When I finally got to sleep, I was plagued with nightmares. I knew I needed to sleep, but I kept shaking myself awake with dreams of that oozing sea. In my dream, the lights never came back on. In my dream, the water just kept rising and rising. It would fill my screaming mouth, my nose, cover my eyes in darkness, and hiss at me as I drowned in it. I would come awake, struggling for air, and fall back asleep to be chased anew by that dark tide. When my alarm went off at 4:30, I desperately wanted to throw it across the room. Banks was waiting for me with a list when I got to work. "1 more night, buddy. After tomorrow night, the warden says we won't need a night detail here anymore. We can just lock the wing up when we go home at 6 p.m. Aside from your usual cleaning, can you set up some chairs? The warden said we'd have to manage the setup since we didn't have orderlies yet. If you set up 10 on one side, I'll set up 10 on the other side when I come in tomorrow. Also, I'm sure he won't eat and he won't answer you, but you can ask Murphy if he wants his last meal or not." I shuddered. I don't really want to talk to him if I can help it. Banks shrugged. "At least let the cameras see you go over and talk to him. I'll see you in the morning, all right?" And with that, I was alone. I put off talking to Murphy for as long as possible. I set up the chairs, unfolding all 20 and placing them in front of the long glass window that showed the observers the inside of the killing room. They had once called the whole area the killing floor, but now the showroom had shrunk to a 20 by 20 box with an upright bed that looked like a cross. We would strap Murphy to that bed tomorrow, pump him full of chemicals, and the state would celebrate our humane and ethical murder of Alex Murphy. He deserved it, of course. I couldn't deny that as I set up the chairs. He had murdered those women in cold blood, and their families would likely show up tomorrow to see that justice was served. I was as far from anti-death penalty as it got, but it seemed like hypocrisy to treat it like anything but what it was. We were killing someone who needed killing, plain and simple. Don't church it up with needless morality. I cleaned the warehouse as best I could, even wiping down the glass observation window, before moving into the main hallway with a mop and bucket. I looked down the hallway then, down the rows of cells, and blinked rapidly as I tried to dissipate the moving shadows. They were clambering up the walls, scuttling in and out of the cells, peeking into Murphy's cell like children at a zoo. They all lived at the corners of my vision, but they saw no need to hide now. I'd seen them, after all, and I guess there was no point being subtle. I put my back to them, mopping down the hallway. I cleaned the well-polished linoleum, someone having recently shined it up, and mopped each cell along the way. I propped my bucket in the door, just in case they decided to try to lock me in, and kept my keys close at hand. The shades were active, but they didn't hinder me tonight. They practically vibrated with excitement whenever I caught a glimpse of them. Were they anticipating Murphy's death too? If so, why? They clearly had some connection with him. Hadn't he brought them with him? The fact that I'd watched him upchuck one the night before seemed to indicate that he had. So, why were they so energetic tonight? The question made me think a little harder about what would happen tomorrow night when we shuffled Murphy loose the mortal coil. Would they let us? Indeed, if they meant to stop us, they would have done it by now. But was the prospect of them wanting him dead any better? What were these creatures he had brought with him? And why did these smiling devils want him here? I puzzled these things over as I cleaned, and it was 3 a.m. when I stepped out of the last clean cell. I looked up the hall to Murphy's door. I couldn't put it off any longer. I approached the cell, peeking in to find him sitting on the bed and staring at the same patch of wall. He'd been staring at that spot for almost a month now, his butt never leaving the spot. I imagined we'd have to throw that mat away once he left, and was thinking, why couldn't I smell him? Despite having eaten nothing, he remained remarkably unchanged. He still bore the look of a mental patient, haggard and maybe a little underfed. I cleared my throat, trying not to think of him with black fluid sliding out of his mouth, and asked the question I had been sent to ask. Murphy, as you know, tomorrow it's execution day. Sarge says I need to ask what you'll have for your last meal. It can be anything, but I need to know what you want, so I can tell the kitchen. Murphy, as expected, just sat there. I shook my head, not sure what I was expecting, and started to turn away. I'd taken 2 steps down the hall when a rusty voice creaked from an unused throat. PB, and J, please. I stopped, thinking I had made the exchange up. I stepped back to the little window and saw that Murphy had turned his head to look at me. A runner of drool slid from the corner of his mouth, and he sucked it back in with minimal effort. I tried not to shudder, tried to pretend I hadn't seen Midnight Black, and asked him to repeat himself. PB and J, no crusts, 2 milks, please. I nodded, writing it down on my notepad. So you can talk. He nodded, his throat swallowing with some effort. I'm sorry for what will happen. I didn't know what they meant. But he started to gag then, his breaths becoming watery as he choked on his own saliva. His throat bulged as he tried to swallow again, but the rest of his words were drowned out as he leaned over and vomited a puddle of black water out. He tried once more, gurgling out something that sounded like coming, before he shook his head and let his face slacken into that dark mask of dim-wittedness. Then he turned his head and stared at the wall until we came back the next night. I stared a few more minutes, moving on before any more revelations threatened to drown my charge. Now here we were, the final countdown, walking up the sparkling linoleum as we led this man to his death. He tromped along, silent as the grave, his wrist chain doing all the talking for him. It was 11:10, his execution set to begin at 11:30 and conclude at midnight. I'd asked why they conducted executions so late, and all Banks could tell me was that was just how it had always been. Midnight was a time of power, I suppose, and it seemed fitting to usher a man out of this world
with the old day. In hindsight, it would be very fitting. Banks had scoffed when I gave him the form that morning. PB&J and cartons of milk. He told you this, or did you make it up because it sounded like something he'd ordered? I shook my head. No, he told me that's what he wanted. It's the only thing I've ever heard him say since he got here. I left out the rest, not wanting more questions. Register and Marks are coming to help us tonight. They'll arrive about 11, but I'm staying until the execution. There's a lot of paperwork still to do, and I'm sure you'd like some company anyway. I nodded, meaning it. The company would be welcome. He bid me good sleep, and I headed home to catch a few winks. The dreams were waiting for me, and for the next 8 hours, I watched the cells and the wing fill up with dark, murky water. This time, though, as the block filled up, I could hear Murphy's final words chasing me up the corridor as the water rushed up to cover me. I'm sorry for what will happen. I'm sorry for what will happen. I didn't know they would. But his words were always drowned out by my own gagging breaths as I slowly choked on the inky sea of my nightmares. We neared the door to the warehouse, the low voices of those assembled spilling out into the hallway. 10 had shown up, mostly women, and none of them had seemed particularly sympathetic to Mr. Murphy. Usually at least one member of the condemned's family will come to see them before their execution, or attend to see them die. Today, though, it was nothing but the victims' families. They'd been escorted in through the west gate, led through the rabbit run, and let in through the side gate that would let them into the warehouse's back door. This not only cut down on the chances that they might introduce contraband, but it also cut down on the likelihood that they would be hooted at by inmates. They had filled the first 3 rows. All of them seemed to want a good view, and now they were waiting for the show. They wouldn't have long to wait. When I arrived at 6, Banks looked up from his paperwork and gave me a highly skeptical look. Are you sure he spoke to you last night? It's okay if you faked paperwork, I don't mind. But if he actually spoke to you, then I'd say you might want to go get checked out by medical, because you might be hallucinating. I shrugged. Must have caught him during a moment of weakness. Why, hasn't said anything else today? Banks shook his head. So far I asked him if he wanted fresh blues, wanted a priest to come say last rites for him, wanted rec one last time, or a shower before it got too late. All met with silence, as usual. Hell, I'd have been certain that you made the meal order up if he hadn't gotten up to take it when I put it on the flap in front of him. For someone who hasn't eaten a bite since he got here, he certainly inhaled those sandwiches. We made preparations for the next few hours, going over our positions and our roles and making sure everyone was ready for tonight. When Register and Marks arrived at 10:30, we went over our plans and parts, ensuring everyone had it right before the time came. When 11 o'clock hit, we made our way to Murphy's cell and prepared to escort him to his final destination. That was how I came to be standing in the door to the warehouse, 16 pairs of eyes on our little group, as we escorted Murphy to the killing box. I had expected anger, but the crowd remained silent as we walked in. Dr. John was waiting by the door to the killing box, the one who oversaw most of the proceedings. There was a time when most of this kind of thing was governed by the warden and the sergeants. These days, the doctor gave the injection, the doctor felt for a pulse, and the doctor called the time of death. He was more in control here than any of us, and we all somehow knew it, except for the grinning warden, who sat in the back row by himself. Murphy clinked along placidly as we approached the door to the killing room. As Banks and Mark stepped inside with him, Dr. John shuffled in behind them with a comical yawn. It was past Dr. John's bedtime, clearly, and he seemed to want to get this over with so he could return to bed. As we stepped inside, I watched Banks lock the door behind him, and Register and I stepped into the warehouse to monitor the spectators. This was mostly to keep people from slipping off onto the compound, accidentally getting into G-Dorm, or, heaven forbid, the compound at large. There would be another pair of guards positioned at the gate to G-Dorm, or there should be, as a two-part prevention method. But from inside the death house, that was purely speculation on my part. I took my spot by the door, watching Dr. John get his instruments ready and begin preparing the injection. There were 3, and while I was aware that they had to be injected in a certain order, that was as much information as I had. I knew they were designed to make the process less painful for the injected, but when the end result is cardiac arrest, how painless can it really be? The crowd sat expectantly, no one talking or moving, and I figured it was their first execution too. Inside the box, they had uncuffed Murphy and set him on the restraining table. His arms and legs were bound to the table, and the hydraulic lift raised it to face the crowd so they could see him perish. With his arms spread like that, I imagined with a truly blasphemous thought that he looked almost Christ-like. He is their salvation, after all, their vehicle into this place. I turned to look behind me, but no one was there. The voice had sounded like it was being whispered into my ear by someone with their lips pressed against my flesh. I glanced around with some small panic as I realized there was no one there. Register looked at me oddly, clearly thinking the execution was making me jumpy. If he'd heard what I heard, he might be less eager to have this done. Inside the killing box, Dr. John was inserting Murphy's IV and making sure it was in place. People had survived this process before due to poor IV placement, and we weren't in any hurry to have a fuck-up like that on our first time out. Boy, were we in for a surprise. A speaker clicked on in the killing box, and Sergeant Banks began the litany read to all condemned men courtesy of the great state of Georgia. Alex Murphy, DC number X59387, you have been sentenced to die by a jury of your peers, sentence passed by a judge in good standing in this great state. Do you have anything to say before sentence is passed? Banks' voice was monotone, almost bored, as he spoke the old catechism of execution. Murphy's voice was that of a man pulled out of a hole who hasn't seen the light of day or heard a human voice in years. It sounded like a crow who's been trained to speak, hoarse, halting, and highly creepy. Kill me now, and bring about the darkness. Kill me now, and bring about the end. That seemed to wipe the smile off the warden's face. Alex Murphy, your sentence shall now be passed, and a medical professional. A loud, clittering chuckle permeated that little room, scampering over the senses like spider legs. The warden and I both looked around simultaneously, looking for its origin, but it seemed to have manifested from nowhere. Laughter in this place seemed perverse indeed. This was not a place for laughter. When death walks among you, the last thing he wants to hear is merriment. Shall administer a lethal dosage of chemicals approved by the state until such time as you are dead, in accordance with state law. A second chuckle skittered through the crowd, and now the people had begun to murmur. I advised them to remain quiet during the final order, and they calmed a little. I was glad they had, because my stomach was doing backflips. If I heard much more of that tittery, canned laughter, heard it again for the rest of my life, I would surely be ready for the nuthatch. If Banks heard it, it didn't affect him at all. May God have mercy on your soul. The time is 11:35 p.m. You may proceed when ready, Doctor. Dr. John nodded and inserted the first needle into the port on the IV bag. The chemical turned the saline a funny color as it flooded the bag. Dr. John lifted his watch, making a note of the time and counting off until he could inject the second syringe. Each one had to be done in a certain order and at a certain time to ensure maximum effect. Murphy seemed to slacken as the drugs took effect, hanging in his restraints with a serene look of bliss etched across his face. His lips moved, the speaker now cut out so we couldn't hear what he was saying, but it must have not sat well with Banks. I could see Banks tell him to be quiet, his lips easier to read than Murphy's, but Murphy went right on talking, it seemed. Something moved beside the door to the killing box then, drawing my attention. The shadow lingered by the door, and I couldn't be sure that it wasn't always there, except except it hadn't been. As I watched it hang there, it grinned at me from its perch in the corner. Was it that same grinning shade that had taunted me a few nights ago? Was it that same ink sentinel that Murphy had retched up with agony? As I looked at it, I thought I could see others from the corner of my eye. Others scampering, capering things that hid just outside my sight. They were taunting me, aware that I was the only one aware of them, but I realized that wasn't the case now. The warden's eyes were also tracking them, making note of their movements, and he suddenly looked very unsure of himself. I saw him get up as Dr. John reached for the second needle and slide it into the bag. "What's he doing?" Register hissed, but I was already following him, walking behind him without fully knowing why. The warden was weaving up the aisle between the chairs, and he looked like he might be slightly drunk. His head moved minutely, his eyes panning around frantically, and when I touched him, he actually jumped. This man who had walked out amidst riots, who regularly smiled in the face of hostile inmates, appeared unsure and terrified when he spun to look at me. "You see them too?" he breathed, and it wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yes, please return to your seat, sir. I don't want to frighten any of the observers, any more than we have to." The shadows were gathering now. Even as I tried to get the warden to take his seat, I could see them circling us like a pack of vultures. I had only ever seen them a few at a time, scampering into a corner or flitting over the linoleum, but now I realized there weren't just a few, there were many. They hunkered, watching as Murphy accepted the second needle, and they seemed to get restless and excited. Inside the killing box, Murphy began to laugh soundlessly. "We have to stop this while there's still time," the warden breathed, and took a staggering step towards the big window. I caught his trailing arm, and when he turned back, his eyes seemed to have turned into serpent slits. I took a step away, but kept hold of that clammy hand. "Sir, you'll startle the spectators. Besides, he's 2 injections in. There's no going back now." He wrenched free of my hand and strode up the aisle. The people looked at him, murmuring louder, and some of them seemed to have taken notice of the nearly constant canned chuckle around us. I longed to put my hands over my ears and block it out, but to do so would make me look as crazy as Murphy. The chuckling was grating, nerve-peeling, and if this is what Murphy heard constantly, then no wonder he was unhinged. The laughter was the kind that bubbles from attic rooms, from asylum windows, from the pits of hell, the laughter of the mad and crazed. The warden came right up to the glass and pounded on it just as Dr. John squirted the last of the solution into Murphy's IV. The liquid was now a striking color in the IV bag, and I saw the last half of the hypo go in with a jerk of surprise. The warden was telling them to stop, telling them to halt, telling them that the execution had been canceled for now and would pick up again later. Dr. John looked at Banks and then back at the warden before leaning forward to shake his head and to press the talk button. "Sir, with all due respect, it's too late." "Are you deaf? I said stop it. I am the warden. This is my world. If I tell you to stop, you—" "Sir, that was the last injection. He's probably already—" That was when Murphy, his head having fallen to his breastbone, started laughing again. As I watched, he had gone slack, his body jerking only once before his head dropped, and he appeared to be asleep. He had taken on the slackness of death for a count of 5, and for a moment I had thought the warden's fears were baseless. Suddenly his head sprang up, though, and his laughter spilled out of him like puke from a drunk. I saw Banks and Marks take a step towards him, Dr. John stepping away in confusion, before Murphy really did retch, and the black slime spilled out of his dead throat and onto the ground. The officer stepped back then, the goo pooling on the floor as it began to puddle in that small room. Even around the vomit, Murphy laughed in that weird, wet way. Someone in the crowd began to scream. Someone else began to vomit. I saw Banks reach for his keys, his other hand covering his own mouth, but it was too late. The vomit was black and inky, and it began to fill the room with a frightening rapidness. Before I'd taken a handful of steps, it was creeping up the side of the room and pooling against the glass. Banks was wading through it to get to the door, Mark nowhere to be seen now, and he grabbed Dr. John as he pulled him along beside him. The warden hissed like a cat when he saw their destination and slammed his fist against the glass. "Don't you dare! It cannot be released!" I saw many of the observers running for the doors, but Register had closed it against them. They couldn't be allowed to just run free on the compound, despite what was happening here. Register was having trouble keeping them corralled, and when I turned to help him, I heard a loud crunching from the glass. The warden was rapping his fist on the darkening glass as Banks tried to open the door. His pounding had cracked the thick protective covering, and I could see the spider cracks sliding up it as the liquid pressed from the inside. It burst, suddenly and apocalyptically, knocking the warden backward and spilling the inky dreck into the warehouse. As it crept closer to me, I began to run for the door. Some enterprising guest had seen the glass break and punched Register in the mouth, knocking him away from the door. He was leaning against the wall, his jaw swelling, and the people spilled out onto the darkened yard. I glanced back and could already see the blackness sloshing out through the hole that had made it. Murphy's head was lolling back, dreck still falling from his lips. As the room swelled with the tide of ooze, I reached down to help Register up, his eyes still riveted to the black creep of death as it started to cover the chairs, and I could see why now. The frothing pudding seemed to be sprouting hands, whole shapeless arms in some cases. They were drawing whatever happened to be in their area into them as they flowed outward, sucking it into that inky soup. The very ooze itself seemed to vibrate, the creatures being gladly drawn into the writhing mass of black pudding. I did not want to join that hellish party. When I dragged Register out, I pulled the door shut behind me, already hearing the incessant laughter bubbling up from the growing pile. The warden was once more in command of the yard, though I hadn't seen him since the glass burst. He was assuring the spectators that they had all simply suffered some kind of delusion, a gas leak or something, and everything would be fine. He instructed Register and I to get these people to the parking lot before turning back to the warehouse doors. The last image of him that I have, that I will ever have, is of him staring at that hateful building, the windows becoming glossy pools of midnight. When we got to the parking lot, I got in my car and drove. Register shouted at me, told me to come back, but I wasn't listening. The last thing I wanted to do was go back to that place, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, he slapped at my door and tried to chase me. He's gone now, left gawking in the parking lot, still a slave to Stragview. I won't be going back, though. Alex Murphy's execution was far from successful, and I don't want to know what will become of any of it afterwards. My only hope is that the tittering in my head gets quieter the further I get from the prison.